Today I will highlight select findings of a qualitative study that examines the reconceptualization and redefinition of the issue of food security from over 30 years of media documents. At the end, I will discuss some of the policy implications of an ever-evolving definition of food security. My name is Natalie. I am a public health doctoral candidate at Temple University. Jennifer Ibrahim is my dissertation chair and advisor. Hunger is a complex, historical, and presently enduring problem. What are the first steps to creating effective policies that can address both hunger and food insecurity? Are these the same issue? To answer these questions, I will not start, like many of the presentations, with a definition of what food security is, because that is precisely the point of this historical review, to define. I will touch on the underlying theories and aims that determine the methodology of this study and relate why it is important to track public and political discourse of an issue. I will then describe the process of sample selection and data collection. Finally, I will address the what, when, and who of issue definition and their basis for formulating correct and effective policies. Findings will illuminate language and policy images in media documents and the contribution of food security discourse to public health policy over the years. At a March 2012 hearing before the Senate Agricultural Committee on Healthy Food Initiatives, Local Production, and Nutrition, I listened with amusement as Senator Pat Roberts, Republican from Kansas, and Senator John Boozman, Republican from Arkansas, begged the witnesses, including Secretary of Agriculture Vilsack, to define what local and rural was in order to be able to legislate for more locally grown goods and rural development. The definitions were either very constrained or not clear, and these policymakers asked for definitions with clear criteria so they could be evaluated and acted upon. If policymakers trying to revise the 2012 Farm Bill are confused about the exact definition of local or rural, then you can be certain that policymakers in the 1980s and 1970s were also trying to nail down a useful definition of food insecurity, and perhaps they found a diversity of aspects to consider. Discourse describing food insecurity, food insecure conditions, and hunger has evolved throughout the decades to focus on specific dimensions of the problem: availability, access, utilization, and stability. Even very specific definitions and policy images may yet convey different meanings to the broader public and policymakers. In short, confusion over definition matters to policymakers. For the images, well, definitions matter to policymakers, but policy images, or images of issues, are particularly important in engaging the public. What is the picture that comes to your mind when I say food insecurity? What about when I say hunger? Are these the same images? Do you envision education, subsistence farming, economic development, nutrition education, fundraising concerts, and food pyramids? Policy best targets that which is conceptualized. The historical perspective of these findings highlight the emergence of new policy images and the prevalence of preferred policy images in a 30-plus year span, showing the scope and breadth of policy images associated with food insecurity. Following the work of Baumgartner and Jones and many others, this study also shows how framing an issue or policy sheds very calculated light on a subject. Over time, we can see how food insecurity is shifted from one frame to the other, or is shared between the two frames of agriculture and public health. I am frequently asked why I chose the 1970s as the starting point for my data collection. The 1970s represent a significant origin of major institutions and policy relating to food security. In 1971, the Food Research and Action Center, FRAC, and the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, were established. The first UN-sponsored World Food Summit was in 1974, and the first World Food Day in 1979. In 1977, dietary goals for the United States was issued by the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs. Food policy also changed dramatically in the 1970s when administrative changes equalized food stamp benefits across the United States and extended food stamps to all U.S. counties. In the 1977 Farm Bill, food stamps evolved from a provisional and pilot program to permanent entitlement policy. And the 1977 Farm Bill was the first to include a nutrition, food stamp, or food-specific title. A new era beginning in the 1970s refocused the public health approach. The USDA acknowledged the evolving nature of the issue of food security, as well as the policy response to these problems in the 1970s, by saying, quote, "Most of our programs were started in response to problems of underconsumption and undernutrition among the low-income population in the 1960s and early 1970s. While these problems remain significant, important new challenges are emerging relating to diet quality, to promote health and well-being," end quote. Finally, food and agriculture journalist Michael Pollan has cited the 1970s as a turning point in U.S. public awareness of the food system, based largely on emerging literature from activists such as Frances Moore Lappé, Wendell Berry, and Barry Commoner. A logical endpoint for this study's time period is the most recent Farm Bill of 2008 and its aftermath up through 2009, when debate revolved primarily around the recently passed Farm Bill and not the upcoming 2012-2013 Farm Bill renewal. This study followed very closely the theory and methods of Baumgartner and Jones, selecting the variables of issue definition, policy image, and framing in particular. They tested their theory of punctuated equilibrium by examining media and congressional issue redefinition on a number of policy topics. They found that strategic use of language can create specific policy images that mobilize new civil groups and political groups, garner public interest in a problem, and inspire innovation to address the problem, which in turn influences programmatic and policy changes. While these variables are not always cyclical or directionally related, there is a bedrock of literature supporting the premise that discourse drives attention and political action. The first aim of this study was to focus on the emergence and recession of certain discourse components in media, and thus describe food security issue development between 1974 and 2009. Aim 2 continues to look at food security as an issue of changing definition, but focuses on who emerges and retreats in changing definitions, when they do so, and what are their affiliations. For Aim 1, I hypothesized that earlier time periods prefer hunger as the more defining term, while latter periods would exhibit greater incidence of food security as the dominating issue definition. I also hypothesized that moving from the past to the present, policy images and framing of food security will evolve from being framed within the context of food production, food supply, and agriculture, or an agriculture frame, to being increasingly framed in the context of diet quality, nutrition, health, and lifestyle, which is a public health frame. For Aim 2 regarding mobilization, I hypothesized an expanding diversity of numbers and types of interest groups and multiple policy images. A coding instrument was designed for conceptual content analysis. Sources for media documents included the Washington Post, The Hill, Roll Call, and the New York Times. A simple query of documents included the terms hunger, food insecurity, and food security in the headline between 1974 and 2009, which created a sample of 1,026 media documents to be screened and read. Exclusion criteria were applied, mostly based on context or relevance. 614 articles were excluded from the final coding, the majority of which, at 47%, were articles on hunger strikes, and therefore not relevant to the study. 9% of excluded articles were reviews of some sort, either book reviews, film reviews, restaurant reviews, and 20% of articles excluded were due to irrelevant use of the word hunger, such as hunger for championship medal or music-hungry teens search for new concert venues. A few documents, 3%, were excluded for various other reasons, for example, references to dieting or prescriptive drug to reduce hunger, or format inconsistencies. Of note are 21% of articles which were excluded from full coding despite being relevant. These were about hunger and food insecurity, but were international in scope only. For example, focusing only on Cambodian refugees and famine, with no reference to the U.S. policy, etc. This subset will be included and taken into account in other parts of the analysis and will be noted. Those articles not excluded yielded a sample of 412. The graph shows the number of articles per year from the sample, which addressed food insecurity, food security, or hunger within the domestic context. The blue bar represents the number of articles coded that were domestic in focus. The orange bar represents the number of articles that had been excluded based on international focus. You can see food security was a huge topic in the first year of the study, 1974, and international coverage of food insecurity waned in the 1980s. Years where internationally focused articles complemented the coverage of the issue domestically were 1985, 1993, 2001, 2002, and 2003, and more recently in 2009. Finally, we can see in which years food insecurity or hunger was truly a hot topic, 1974, 83, 1985. Never again since the mid-1970s has the topic received as much press. This slide very briefly touches upon the major aspects of the coding process. It is not comprehensive. Validity and credibility of the coding instrument were sought by grounding the variables used in theoretical approaches by Baumgartner and Jones, using similar data sources as Baumgartner and Jones, using a multiplicity of data sources for evidence, and whenever possible using established definitions, policy images, and rhetoric common in the literature surrounding food security and agriculture. Frequency. We searched for 4 terms, food security, food insecurity, hunger, and farm bill, to first count the frequency of iterations of relevant terms used within each text. For definition, the definition identified the degree to which the issue was conceptualized as either hunger or food insecurity. We adopted the USDA's 2006 distinction between the 2 terms, and I was able to code each article in their issue definition leanings. The USDA makes a clear and explicit distinction between food security and hunger. Hunger may result from severe food insecurity and is a physiological state, feeling hungry from lack of food, reduced food intake, or change in eating patterns. Food insecurity is a condition associated with economic and social conditions or environmental and macro-causal factors that prevent a person feeling secure in their ability to have or prepare food. This is less a state a person is in, rather it is more the conditions or causes that put the person in that state. 4 dimensions of food security are used by the World Health Organization and Food and Agriculture Organization in assessing food security: availability, access, utilization, and stability. These are not related to the difference between hunger and food insecurity. Often an article touched upon all 4 dimensions and was coded as such. Policy images were selected based on preliminary content analyses of a random sampling of media, academic, and congressional documents, and through reference to food security literature. 15 prescribed images were listed in the coding instrument, and 2 open-ended options, all coded by degree, allowed the tracing of both depth and breadth of the policy images associated with food insecurity. You will see all 15 or more policy images listed on a later slide. For mobilization, primary organizations or interest groups and individuals were noted and categorized by type: government or international, private or special interest group, public or nonprofit group, or an individual. They were also classified by issue area: agriculture, public health or health, food security, anti-hunger, or other. Only the top 10 primary groups and persons were identified with detailed information. Secondary groups and persons were recorded by name only and included in the final count of groups or individuals mobilized per document. Finally, framing. Each article, the coder would ask, is the document framed more from a public health or health point of view, or from an agriculture industry point of view, or other? So on to what was found. Confirming what might be intuitive, when covering stories on food insecurity and hunger, hunger is the preferred terminology in media discourse, in fact, overwhelmingly so. The Farm Bill is almost never mentioned in the media. You can see the very littlest peak, the purple bar, most easily seen at 2007. And also by comparison, the term food insecurity is more frequently used in media than food security, the terms being 2 sides of the same coin. Both the absolute number and averages or weighted number based on how many articles were written each year do matter. In the following slides, I will usually include a reference bar to help remind us when absolute changes are occurring versus change being more an artifact of total number of articles. In this case, it's the comparison between prevalence of terms that is of most interest, but the pale blue line does show us how many articles there were per year. This study also examined the more implied and perhaps more comprehensive definitions of hunger and food insecurity. Here we ask what kind of hunger was really being conceptualized. These were mutually exclusive by degree. For example, an article could not have both hunger and food insecurity as the primary issue definition. One had to be selected as primary, the other could be secondary. You see that hunger is the usual definition used in media, and more recently, such as in 2003 and 2008, food insecurity was slightly more implied than hunger in media coverage. So according to my hypotheses, over time, the evolution towards a more comprehensive conceptualization of food insecurity is being conveyed, but only mildly so. For dimensions of food security, the most useful comparison is between the dimensions. The most prevalent dimension is the media discourse. In media discourse of food security is that of access. See the orange line. Except for 1976 through 1978 and 2001, most articles focused on physical and economic ability to access available and appropriate food. Think food stamps or transportation to a supermarket for the elderly. Because this was a U.S.-centric study, the dimension of utilization, the gray line, was not very prevalent. Non-food input resources for food security, like food storage or clean water, were not common challenges to obtaining food security. Finally, as the prevailing issue in 1974, the availability or supply and production of food has declined compared to that of access. This parallels well with policy that has focused more and more on diverse approaches to food security rather than just supporting agricultural outputs. Here we see that the blunt question of how is this article broadly framed yields a public health or nutrition framework more often than articles framed from an agricultural perspective. Exceptions being 1977, when more articles were from an agricultural perspective, and 1990 and 1999, where public health framing had a downward trend and agriculture experienced an upward trend. As a snapshot of all 35 years combined, we can see that the overall prevalence of particular policy images associated with food insecurity and hunger. The left side of the chart presents the 15 fixed or predetermined images. The right-hand side lists a few policy images discovered throughout the coding process. Overall, in 35 years of media coverages, articles on food insecurity or hunger were most associated with anti-hunger advocacy or work, and policy, politics, and policymaking. Anti-hunger policy image was defined during coding as program, policies, or individuals aimed at reducing hunger or its causes or effects. Anything related to soup kitchens or food banks fell into this policy image. Policy, policymaking, and politics were exactly that. Anything having to do with the legislative process, outcome, or politicians. Not surprisingly, both international hunger or /food aid and U.S. nutrition programs were prominent policy images overall. U.S. nutrition programs were usually imaged by the food stamp program, but WIC, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, and school lunch and breakfast programs also lent to this policy image. Obesity represented a much smaller slice of the policy image pie than I expected. Nutrition and malnutrition was only slightly more visible as a policy image than agricultural supply and production, contrasting the two ends of the food system spectrum, the production of food and the health effects of eating food. To look more closely at trends over time, these charts are organized into 5-year intervals. International hunger and food aid, the yellow line, decreased sharply during the 1980s. This decade was filled with discourse on domestic issues of food insecurity and the public safety net that was being undermined by the administration. Focus on international food aid was at its lowest in 1989 through 1993. National security in the 1970s was defined in large part by our grain reserves. Farms were the bedrock of national security, and their productivity received more media coverage in the 1970s than at any other time since. It seems like this policy image is slowly but steadily regaining coverage, perhaps as we start to link agricultural production to health and well-being, not just the output, but also the methods and process. Think organic and GMOs. Agriculture again is being incorporated into a comprehensive concept of food security, mildly so if you look at the trend. You can see how welfare discourse associated with hunger mimics the trend of U.S. Nutrition Assistance Program discourse. An intuitive relationship exists between these two policy images. Both welfare, associated discourse, and U.S. nutrition programs discourse were at their highest in 1979 through 1983. These hot topics were often backlash debates on Reagan's welfare reforms, which were largely unpopular with food security and anti-hunger activists. This chart represents some of the diverse or non-traditional policy images that were associated with hunger and food insecurity. You can see that obesity is essentially flatlined and doesn't emerge as a policy image associated with hunger, food security until this last decade, the 2000s. The rising trend in political will responsibility, it's the darker blue line, followed closely after times when domestic discourse on welfare reforms and budget reconciliation peaked, or when U.S. food safety net programs were threatened either by increasing numbers of the needy or decreased funding by the government. In the 1984 through 1988 period, as well as in 1999 through 2003, there were a flurry of letters to the editors of these data sources that urged policymakers to take action to help overburden soup kitchens and food pantries. The data also show that sustainable agriculture and GMO/agricultural technology was virtually forgotten in the middle years of the study, but we see a small flurry of these policy images early on in the 1970s and even more visible increases later on in the 2000s. Their contribution to food security discourse seems to be growing. The same holds true for agriculture subsidy images and local/community food security policy images. Moving on to mobilization, this chart shows us that between the three types of groups generally mobilized on food security issues, not surprisingly, anti-hunger and food security advocates are most visible in the media. Oh, we're missing a label line, but the top line would be anti-hunger advocates. Many of these groups in the data were hunger-specific, such as religiously run soup kitchens, which are more distant from traditional public health organizations. Still, we also have to consider some overlap between anti-hunger and public health organizations, as they generally espouse the same goals. The take-home point here is that the agricultural groups and public health groups can do much more to become more visibly mobilized, at least to and through the media. This chart focuses on the classification of different organizations and individuals. While there's a lot of information here, what I find of most interest is that over the 35-year period, the trends do not consistently show an increased mobilization of any particular category or type of group, thus giving no support to a diversified and increased mobilization hypothesis. Certainly not political individuals or private or special interest groups dominate the discourse. Also, I like that there is a convergence in 2004 through 2009, where the level of engagement of all sectors and types of individuals seems to be honing into a concentrated, more equal contribution to discourse. Everyone seems to have a more equal voice. Finally, for name calling, here's a more detailed description of who was actually mobilized. First, the analysis really highlighted the role of musicians as advocates for food security. They are a highly mobilized group in anti-hunger fundraising and awareness, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, where grassroots efforts and non-research oriented or non-experts were key to media discourse. Fundraising concerts featured singers like Harry Chapin, Kenny Rogers, Bob Dylan, Paul McCartney. Other notable individuals included people with political or policy influence: Pope John Paul II, chairs of the House Agriculture Committee and Select Committee on Hunger, people like Representative Mickey Leland from Texas, Representative Tony Hall from Ohio, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and all of the Secretaries of Agriculture. Also, infamy reigns in public media discourse. The squeaky wheels of Senator Jesse Helms, Republican from North Carolina, and the Senate Agriculture Committee Chair. Also, Counselor to President Reagan Edward Meese III and J. Claiborne LaForce, who was chair of President Reagan's task force on food assistance, had a lot of negative things to say about the food stamp program, and the media really picked this up. In these articles, no private or special interest group or for-profit organization stood out in their prevalence throughout the 35 years of the study. Very few surprising leaders or political entrepreneurs emerged. The USDA was by far the most mentioned or involved, with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization also significantly above the pack. Government and international organizations were grouped together because of their policymaking influence. All of the U.S. presidents during the study period were certainly key political players, with President Reagan and his administration receiving the most media coverage, and President Obama the least. U.S. Aid and the U.S. Conference of Mayors were also highly visible groups involved in the discourse. Most notable were the House Select Committee on Hunger and the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, with the House Agriculture Committee being mentioned more than its Senate counterpart. Finally, in the prolific nonprofit public sector, numerous individuals who founded or ran soup kitchens and food banks, most of them religiously affiliated, made up significant counts of both primary and secondary groups or individuals of the mobilized. America's Second Harvest, FRAC, and Share Our Strength are notable domestic organizations. Notable international nonprofit groups included, but was not exhaustive of, Bread for the World, CARE, Catholic Relief Services, and Oxfam. Later analyses will focus on when these groups emerged or were sustained in the discourse of food insecurity. Before I close, I must mention some of the caveats of this study. Only select findings were presented here. There's so much more data and analysis to be shared. More nuanced associations and comparisons can and will be made. Stay tuned for more studies correlating this quantitative data with Farm Bill policy histories and a historical survey. The sample selection process, both in sources and in query, yielded a very U.S.-centric sample. This makes sense in that the policy implications will be drawn specifically to one U.S. policy, the Farm Bill. The only approach to international perspectives of food insecurity in this data came from food aid and trade to foreign countries. Also, by association, hunger is more related to public health outcomes than agriculture input, at least by terminology, and in the lay media and understanding. Thus, an underrepresentation in agriculture framing might have occurred. Finally, discussion of the findings is limited because this presentation does not compare media data to congressional and academic data. Triangulation with these other data sources are forthcoming. In conclusion, the definition matters and is ever evolving. Today, I very briefly touched on the details of what the issue of food insecurity looks like, when it looks or is defined a certain way over a 35-year period, and who is instrumental in the discourse shaping the issue. There continues to be diversification of the issue. New terminology and policy solutions are being sought. But does diversification make it harder or easier to legislate for the issue? With diversification comes the practical difficulty of being able to measure the scope of a particular dimension or definition of a problem, as well as pinning down appropriate and effective policy solutions to these specific problems. The public health field also needs to examine their presence and desired role in the future of food security. Should there be a distinction between public health and anti-hunger groups? The trends and successes of this data represents the ability of public health professionals and policymakers to expand the focus of their goals in obtaining a healthy, active life, and not just eliminating hunger. Further studies will align this data with the policy implications, focusing on the Farm Bill and their relationship to these evolutions in food insecurity. The largest food and agriculture legislation in the U.S., the Farm Bill, is currently under debate. Some of the debate and delay of the 2012/2013 bill is due to fiscal matters, but some of the debate is occurring because we aren't clear of what we're aiming to improve or eliminate. Is it hunger? Is it food insecurity? Is it food security? There is still wiggle room for redefining food security in the upcoming Farm Bill, and this will influence financial and political support of specific programs of the bill. So far, this study shows that there is untapped potential in clearly defining, measuring, and making hunger a strongly competitive issue for policymakers, and making food security or food insecurity the leading definition driving mobilization and policy. Food security policy will only be as effective as the discourse that inspires political action. Thank you.